Hello guys, I'm glad you are here tonight. You've clicked on this story to drift into history, and maybe even into sleep. But before we dive into the lives of warriors long ago, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? I always find it fascinating to imagine how many people, scattered across the world, are listening at the same moment. Perhaps you are lying in bed in the early morning, maybe traveling on a train, or sitting quietly in the evening, letting your mind wander. Now let's set the stage. Imagine the world of the Middle Ages, when kingdoms rose and fell, when battles shaped the fate of entire nations, and when warriors lived a life very different from our own, yet in some ways still strangely familiar. To understand what it was like for a warrior in medieval times, we need to start not on the battlefield, but in the quieter, everyday moments of their world. Most warriors did not spend every day fighting. Instead, they spent far more time preparing, waiting, and simply surviving. Picture a small wooden hall, smoky from the fire burning in the center. The warriors sit together on long benches, their armor stacked in a corner, their swords resting by the wall. Their lives were filled with a mixture of anticipation and routine, always carrying the knowledge that at any moment a messenger could arrive with news of war, summoning them to march into danger. Food was both comfort and necessity, and it shaped their daily lives. Bread was almost always present, baked from coarse grains that gave it a dense, heavy texture. Sometimes, if the harvest had been poor, the flour might be mixed with ground beans or even bark to stretch it further, making the bread bitter. Meat was a treasure, not eaten every day, though hunters sometimes brought back wild boar, venison, or rabbits. On feast days, whole animals were roasted over open flames, the smell filling the hall with smoky richness. Warriors loved these feasts, not only for the food but for the sense of brotherhood they created, the laughter, the boasting of past battles, the songs echoing into the night. But not every meal was a feast. Often it was a simple porridge of oats or barley, sometimes flavored with onions or leeks, and on fasting days, when the church demanded abstinence from meat, fish became the main source of protein. Warriors by rivers and coasts were luckier, as fresh fish could be caught, but inland soldiers often ate salted fish transported from far away, the taste sharp and salty on the tongue. Beer and ale were the common drink, brewed weak for everyday use, while stronger brews were saved for celebrations. Wine existed too, though it was rarer in northern lands and prized by those who could afford it. Training was a constant part of life, even in times of peace. Warriors needed to keep their bodies ready for the strain of battle. Imagine them in the courtyard of a castle, practicing with wooden swords, their strikes echoing as they clashed against shields. It wasn't only strength that mattered, but also stamina and skill. Carrying heavy armor, often made of chainmail or layers of padded cloth, demanded endurance. The armor was not just protection, it was also a burden, making every step slower, every climb up a muddy hill harder. Yet a warrior had to move with it, to fight as though it were part of him, and that required endless practice. Entertainment was just as important, though it looked different than what we know today. After long days of drilling or guard duty, warriors might gather to play dice or other games of chance, carved from bone or wood. Some gambled away coins or small possessions, the thrill of luck offering a brief escape from the discipline of military life. Music too was ever present. Minstrels played lutes and harps, telling tales of heroes and past wars, stories that stirred pride but also a sense of belonging to something greater than oneself. It's easy to picture a warrior leaning back, closing his eyes, and letting the rhythm of the song carry him away, just as you might do now while listening to this story. And then there were the rumors and whispers that traveled among men. Warriors always loved stories, whether of monsters lurking in the forest, witches casting spells under the moonlight, or distant lands where treasures were said to lie. Some were half-believed, others were shared only for amusement, but in a world without newspapers or television, rumors were their entertainment and sometimes their guide. A rumor of an approaching army could set a village on edge, just as much as a tale of hidden gold could inspire men to set out on risky journeys. Religion also wrapped itself around every part of a warrior's life. Churches stood at the center of villages and towns, bells marking the hours of prayer. Before battle, warriors prayed for protection, for forgiveness, for victory. They believed that life and death in war were not just matters of strength or strategy, but also of divine will. To fall in battle was sometimes seen as honorable, but it was also terrifying, for it meant facing judgment in the afterlife. And so, prayers whispered under helmets were as common as sword strikes on the battlefield. Imagine the weight of all this, the food that sustained them, the games that entertained them, the constant training, the heavy burden of faith and fear. This was the daily world of a medieval warrior. Not every day was filled with blood and steel, yet every day carried the shadow of war. And in that shadow, men laughed, ate, played, and prayed, trying to live a life that could end at any moment. When we picture the life of warriors in the Middle Ages, it is easy to imagine only the clang of swords and the roar of battle, yet those moments were rare compared to the long stretches of travel and waiting. A warrior's life was one of movement, often across endless miles of fields, forests, and mountains. Picture a column of men marching along a muddy road, boots sinking into the earth, carrying not only weapons but bundles of supplies tied across their backs. Horses were valuable and not always available for every soldier, so many men walked. The sound of hundreds of feet moving in rhythm, the creak of carts, the occasional whinny of horses, and the clatter of armor created a steady background of noise that could last for days. The journeys themselves were grueling. Roads were poor, little more than tracks of dirt that turned to rivers of mud after rain. Bridges were often fragile wooden constructions, swaying beneath the weight of armed men. Rivers sometimes had to be forded directly, leaving soldiers wet and shivering as they pressed onward. A march could stretch for weeks, and the greatest enemy was often not another army but hunger, cold, and exhaustion. To keep spirits up, men told stories as they walked, sometimes singing crude songs to pass the time, their voices echoing through the countryside. At night, the camps came alive. Fires flickered across open fields or forest clearings, casting shadows on tents made of canvas or animal hides. Warriors huddled around the warmth, drying damp clothes, repairing gear, and sharing whatever food could be spared. It wasn't always enough. Supplies from the lords or kings often failed to reach the front lines, leaving men to scavenge or take from nearby villages. This was a harsh reality. Armies sometimes brought ruin not only to enemies but also to their own people, stripping barns of grain, taking livestock, leaving families behind in despair. To a warrior, this was survival, but to peasants it was devastation, and such tensions often lingered long after the soldiers moved on. The sounds of a medieval camp would have been a strange mixture. The crackling of fires, the murmur of prayers, the clink of armor being mended, the rolling laughter of dice games, and sometimes the cries of pain from the wounded or sick. Illness spread easily when men crowded together, and without modern medicine, even a small wound could fester into something deadly. A cut on the hand from sharpening a sword, a blister rubbed raw from marching, or a tooth infection could mean weeks of suffering. Herbs and salves were used, but healing was slow and uncertain. Some warriors trusted in charms or amulets, believing these held protective powers against sickness and misfortune. Despite the hardships, there was also a deep bond between the men. Comradeship grew in the shared struggle. Warriors leaned on each other for strength, not only in battle but in the silence of long marches or the stillness of cold nights. To sit by the fire, sharing a loaf of bread or a flask of ale, was to feel part of a brotherhood. Many spoke of their hopes, their families left behind, their dreams of land or wealth promised as reward. These conversations connected them, making strangers into companions, companions into brothers. Yet, alongside that closeness, there was always a sense of hierarchy. Not all warriors were equal. A knight, sworn to his lord, carried both privilege and responsibility. His armor gleamed brighter, his horse stronger, his meals richer. A common foot soldier looked on with a mix of admiration and envy, for knights lived closer to nobility, often eating better and sleeping in greater comfort. Still, in battle, the lives of knights and soldiers were bound together. The charge of a knight on horseback could shatter enemy lines, but it was the steady wall of infantry that held ground, shields raised and spears braced, enduring the brutal press of combat. When dawn broke over a medieval encampment, the air was heavy with smoke from dying fires. Warriors rose stiff and sore, strapping on armor once again. The morning meal was often plain, hard bread softened in broth or ale, maybe a bit of cheese if they were lucky. The day might bring more marching, more drills, or perhaps the order to prepare for battle. Those moments before fighting began were some of the hardest. Warriors stood in formation, the chill of fear creeping in. The mind ran with thoughts of survival, of family, of the possibility that this day might be the last. And yet, they held their ground, bound by duty, by loyalty, and by the knowledge that running was often more dangerous than fighting. Life in war was never just about swords and armor. It was about endurance, about finding a way to keep moving forward despite the constant shadow of death and uncertainty. It was about the stories whispered by the fireside, the taste of a rare feast after days of hunger, the relief of a safe march after endless danger. To live as a warrior was to live with contradiction, to laugh loudly with friends one night and face death in silence the next morning. And so, as we drift further into this world, remember that the life of a medieval warrior was not one of endless glory, but of endless struggle, painted with brief moments of joy, companionship, and hope. As the armies moved through the lands, the presence of warriors shaped not only the battlefield but the very villages and towns they passed. To the peasants, the sight of armored men approaching on horseback was both awe-inspiring and frightening. The glitter of metal in the sun, the banners snapping in the wind, the steady rhythm of hooves and boots. It could mean protection, but it could just as easily mean loss. For a warrior, these journeys across villages and farmland were reminders of what they fought for and, at the same time, what their presence often destroyed. The roads themselves carried stories. Merchants traveled them, pilgrims walked them, and armies thundered down them. A warrior marching along a familiar road might pass shrines built at crossroads, small stone markers where locals left offerings to saints, hoping for safe passage. Sometimes, these shrines became resting points for soldiers as well. Kneeling briefly, whispering prayers, they left behind coins or simple tokens, seeking blessings before continuing into uncertainty. Religion was never far, and belief carried them when strength began to falter. But faith alone could not fill empty stomachs. Rations were precious and often stretched thin. A soldier's pack might contain dried bread, strips of salted meat, or if lucky, a small pouch of dried fruit or nuts. The food was tough, sometimes nearly impossible to chew, but it kept hunger at bay. When an opportunity arose, warriors roasted whatever animals they caught. Hares, birds, or even frogs from streams. Smoke from campfires often hung heavy in the air, a mix of wood, fat, and damp earth. Eating was both necessity and ritual. Hands dirty from marching, faces lit orange by the flames, voices low as they shared their meal. The nights, however, brought more than food and laughter. They brought stories. Around the fire, warriors told tales of lands they had never seen, of kings both just and cruel, of ancient battles whose echoes still haunted the earth. Some told stories to impress, boasting of victories or exaggerating encounters with foes. Others spun tales of superstition, of ghosts wandering old ruins, of creatures in the forests, of curses waiting on battlefields where too many had died. And though many laughed, when the fire died low and shadows stretched across the camp, even the bravest felt a chill creep into their bones. For those who could not sleep, the night watch was a heavy responsibility. Standing guard while the others rested meant hours of silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves, the calls of owls, or the distant howl of wolves. The weight of armor pressed down, but the weight of expectation pressed more. Falling asleep on watch was a crime punishable by death, for it endangered the entire company. So the weary warrior fought against his own fatigue, gripping his spear tighter, staring into the darkness, listening for the faintest sign of movement. Armor itself was another companion, as constant as hunger or fatigue. For some, it was a suit of chainmail, thousands of interlinked rings that clinked softly with every step, heavy on the shoulders, rubbing raw against skin despite the padded tunic beneath. For wealthier knights, armor might include plates of steel, carefully fitted, shining when polished, intimidating when seen by enemies. Maintaining this armor was a task of its own. Rust could creep in if left damp, so men spent hours rubbing metal with oil or sand, determined to keep their lifeline intact. A broken strap, a loose buckle, or a weakened link could mean death in battle. Weapons were treated with equal care. Swords were the pride of many warriors, passed down through generations, often given names and spoken of as though alive. Yet swords were expensive, and many soldiers carried simpler arms. Spears, axes, maces, or bows. Spears were particularly valuable, long, versatile, and deadly in formation. An army of spearmen could halt charging horses, their points bristling like a wall of iron. Archers, though sometimes dismissed as lesser, held great power from a distance, their arrows falling like rain, darkening the sky before piercing shields and flesh. Each weapon told its own story, and each required discipline to master. Discipline itself was perhaps the greatest test. Wars were not won by individual skill alone, but by the unity of men moving as one. Drills repeated endlessly until muscles remembered movements without thought. Hold the shield steady, thrust the spear in rhythm, march in step. For a warrior, discipline was both comfort and cage, shaping every part of life. It taught obedience to lords and kings, yet it also gave structure in a world where chaos was always near. Between campaigns, when battles paused and armies returned to their homes, warriors tried to reclaim something of ordinary life. Some went back to farms, plowing the soil, mending roofs, working side by side with family. Others remained in service to their lords, training younger men, guarding castles, or traveling with their masters as escorts. Yet even in these quieter times, the memory of war lingered. A scar on the arm, a limp from an old wound, or simply the sound of metal striking metal in practice could summon visions of battle long past. It is here that we begin to see the strange rhythm of a warrior's life. Endless waiting, harsh marches, fleeting feasts, laughter that vanished into silence, fear that returned with every dawn. And through all of it, the awareness that death was never far away. Yet in that awareness, life burned brighter. A shared jug of ale tasted sweeter. A joke carried more warmth. A song sung under the stars lingered longer in the heart. Because when tomorrow might bring battle, every small moment of peace became priceless. The clash of battle often overshadows the quiet struggles that shaped a warrior's life. Yet when battle finally came, it was unlike anything the imagination could prepare for. The build-up was often long and nerve-wracking. For hours or even days, men might wait within sight of the enemy, watching the opposing banners ripple in the wind, hearing the faint sounds of horns and drums across the field. The air seemed heavy, every sound sharper, every heartbeat louder. To stand in a line, shoulder to shoulder with companions, staring into the faces of men who would soon try to kill you, was a trial of the spirit more than the body. When the order finally came, it began not with chaos but with a rhythm. Horns blasted, drums beat, voices shouted commands. Armies moved like living creatures, advancing in waves, shields raised, spears bristling. Horses thundered across the earth, knights lowering their lances, the sound of hooves striking like thunder. Then the clash erupted, and the calm before battle vanished. The first impact was a storm. Spears splintered, shields cracked, men shouted in rage and fear. The ground shook under the weight of bodies. The smell of iron, sweat, mud, and blood mixed into something unforgettable. For a warrior, the fight was not a clean exchange of blows, but a desperate struggle for survival. Vision blurred, sounds overlapped, the world shrank to the small circle around you. The man in front, the weapon in your hand, the shield at your side. Combat was brutal, close, and often clumsy. A sword might not pierce a well-made helmet, but it could dent it and leave the man beneath stunned. A mace, heavy and blunt, crushed through armor with horrifying force. Arrows hissed through the air, sometimes striking shields, sometimes finding gaps in mail or slipping under helmets. Horses screamed when wounded. Men slipped in mud turned red. The chaos was overwhelming, and yet within it, training and instinct guided movements. But battles rarely ended quickly. Hours could pass in grinding stalemates, men pushing against one another, lines breaking and reforming. Exhaustion was the enemy as much as steel. Breathing grew ragged, arms ached from the weight of weapons, legs trembled from holding ground. Many fell not from wounds but from sheer exhaustion, trampled underfoot as the fight surged on. And then, often suddenly, one side broke. Fear spread like fire, men began to flee, and once discipline crumbled, chaos consumed the battlefield. Warriors knew this was the most dangerous moment. Not when lines held, but when they collapsed. Pursuing forces struck down the fleeing, and mercy was rare in the heat of victory. A man who dropped his sword might still be cut down as he ran. Only after the rout, when the shouting faded and the field lay still, did silence return. The aftermath of battle was haunting. The ground was littered with broken weapons, fallen banners, and bodies of men and horses alike. Survivors stumbled among the dead, searching for comrades, looting what they could, finishing off the wounded in grim silence. The smell of blood lingered heavy in the air, carried by the wind across villages and fields. For those who lived, victory often felt hollow, weighed down by the cost paid in lives. Healing after battle was slow and uncertain. Wounds were washed with wine or vinegar, wrapped in cloth, sometimes stitched crudely with bone needles. Herbs like yarrow or comfrey were used to stop bleeding or ease pain, but infections claimed many lives in the days after fighting. A simple cut could kill, a broken bone might never mend properly. Those who survived carried scars, not only on their bodies but deep within their minds. Nightmares, sudden fears, and the memory of screams followed them long after the field was quiet. Yet even in this darkness, warriors found ways to continue. Victorious lords held feasts, celebrating their survival, raising cups of ale and wine, toasting the fallen. Music returned, songs were sung of bravery, though often the tales stretched the truth, polishing the horrors of battle into shining stories of honor. For the warriors themselves, such songs were both comforting and strange, for they knew how different the reality had been. Still, stories mattered. They gave meaning to the suffering, turning individual struggles into part of a greater whole. Warriors clung to these tales, repeating them to younger men, passing them on so that even when fear and loss threatened to overwhelm, the story of what they endured remained alive. In this way, every battle, every march, every long night was not only endured but remembered, woven into the greater tapestry of history. And so, the life of the medieval warrior was always balanced between extremes. Moments of quiet companionship and sudden violence, of laughter by the fire and terror on the field, of prayers whispered in peace and screams shouted in chaos. To live such a life was to live with the knowledge that nothing was certain except the bond of brothers and the shadow of war. Family life was another fragile thread in the tapestry of a warrior's existence. Some men married and tried to build homes between campaigns, raising children who often knew their fathers only in fragments, brief months of peace before another call to arms. The bond was tender but uncertain, for war could tear it apart at any moment. Wives bore the weight of absence, keeping farms alive, raising children alone, praying for safe returns. Letters were rare, often impossible, so families waited with little news, clinging to rumors carried by travelers. To return home after years of absence meant finding children grown, wives aged, lives moved forward without them. And yet, in those brief reunions, joy burned fiercely, even if it was shadowed by the knowledge it might not last. Festivals were among the few times when warriors could truly forget their burdens. Villages celebrated with dances around bonfires, music played on pipes and drums, tables laden with bread, cheese, roasted meats, and sweet honey cakes. Warriors drank deeply, sometimes competing in games of strength, wrestling in the dirt, racing horses, or testing their skill with bow and arrow. These moments of joy were vital, for they reminded men that life was more than war, that laughter and song still had power even after bloodshed. But even in times of peace, danger lurked. Bandits haunted roads, wolves prowled forests, and sickness spread easily through crowded towns. A warrior never truly set aside his sword. It hung by his side even at festivals, a silent reminder that safety was fragile. And beyond all this, whispers of larger conflicts were constant. Rumors of rival lords gathering men, of kings seeking to expand their borders, of crusades calling warriors to march far from home into lands they had never seen. For many, this possibility of leaving everything behind for distant wars was both terrifying and enticing. The promise of riches, of glory, of eternal salvation if one died in holy service. It pulled at hearts in ways that simple farming or guarding a castle never could. To set sail across seas, to see foreign cities, to fight under strange skies. It was a dream for some, a nightmare for others. Yet when the call came, many answered because in their world, the life of a warrior was not truly a choice. It was duty, honor, and fate woven together. So even in the quiet moments, the shadow of war remained. It lingered in the prayers whispered before sleep, in the weight of armor waiting in the corner, in the restless glances toward the horizon. And through it all, warriors lived with the knowledge that peace was never more than a pause, a breath between storms. When the battlefield finally faded into the distance, warriors faced another kind of struggle, the return to ordinary life. For many, stepping away from the clash of swords and back into the rhythm of village or castle life was harder than it seemed. The adrenaline of war lingered, and silence felt strange after the endless roar of men and horses. To walk through fields of wheat, to hear birds in the trees, to sit at a table with family again. It was comforting, but also unsettling, because the mind carried images that could not be left behind. Some warriors returned to farms, taking up plows in place of spears. Their hands, once blistered from swords, now gripped rough wooden handles, guiding oxen across the soil. Neighbors greeted them with admiration, sometimes even with fear, for the scars they bore told stories without words. At harvest time, these men worked beside their families, yet their eyes often drifted toward the horizon, watching the roads, half expecting the next call to arms. Peace was never permanent. A new feud, a raid, or a rival lord could summon them back to war at any time. Others remained in the service of their lords. Castles needed guards, and knights had duties beyond the battlefield. They trained younger squires, taught them how to ride, how to hold a sword, how to polish armor until it gleamed. These squires, often boys from noble families, looked up to the older warriors with both respect and nervousness, knowing that one day they would be tested in the same brutal way. For the veterans, passing down knowledge was a kind of legacy, ensuring that their own hardships had meaning. Life within the castle walls carried its own rhythm. In the mornings, the clang of practice weapons echoed through the yards. Blacksmiths hammered iron into shape, sparks flying as swords and armor were repaired or remade. The smell of hay and horses filled the stables, where grooms tended to steeds that were as prized as gold. Kitchens bustled with activity, baking bread, roasting meat, stirring thick stews in cauldrons over open fires. At night, the great hall came alive with torches and music, laughter rolling across the long wooden tables. Yet for all the warmth of feasts and the cheer of music, there was also a stark contrast between the lives of nobles and common soldiers. Lords sat at the high tables, drinking fine wine, eating tender cuts of meat, while lower-ranking warriors and servants shared simpler fare at the far ends. Still, even the humblest soldier felt a sense of belonging when the hall filled with song. Minstrels recited tales of distant battles or spun stories of romance and tragedy, weaving history and legend into one. Many a warrior sat listening with a distant gaze, caught between memory and dream. As whispers of distant wars spread through the taverns and halls, many warriors began to dream of lands beyond their own. The talk of crusades carried like wildfire, filling men with visions of deserts, great walled cities, and treasures beyond imagination. For some, it was the promise of salvation, the idea that marching under the sign of the cross could wipe away sins and secure a place in heaven. For others, it was the lure of adventure, of seeing places that peasants only heard of in stories. Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople. And for many, it was simply the command of their lords, an order that left no choice. The preparations for such journeys were monumental. Men who had lived their entire lives within a few miles of their villages now found themselves gathering in vast armies, ready to march across continents. Horses were shod, wagons loaded, swords sharpened, shields painted with symbols of faith and family. The roads filled with the noise of countless feet and hooves, with women and children trailing behind, carrying what little they could. It was not only warriors who marched. Priests, cooks, merchants, and even pilgrims joined, creating an endless moving river of humanity. Imagine the shock of a soldier seeing the sea for the first time. The smell of salt in the air, the vast horizon stretching endlessly, ships rocking in the harbors, sails billowing with the wind. Boarding such a vessel was terrifying for many who had never left land, and the voyage ahead was filled with sickness, cramped quarters, and constant fear of storms. Yet to step onto foreign soil was to step into a world that felt almost like another planet. The heat of the eastern lands was unlike anything a northern warrior had known. The sun burned down mercilessly, armor grew almost unbearable, and water became more precious than gold. Desert winds carried fine dust that coated skin and mouth, turning every breath dry. Local foods, spiced meats, strange fruits, and flatbreads were both a wonder and a challenge to men used to their heavy porridge and ale. Some adapted, some grew sick, but all marveled at the markets filled with colors and scents unknown to their homelands. The cities themselves were unlike anything they had imagined. Towers of stone, glittering mosaics, domes that caught the sunlight, streets crowded with merchants shouting in languages they could not understand. The sight of silks, perfumes, and precious metals dazzled men who had come from wooden villages and muddy fields. For a warrior, such splendor was both awe-inspiring and frustrating, for often these cities were places they were expected to conquer rather than admire. Battles in these lands were nothing like the familiar clashes in northern fields. Here, enemies fought with curved swords and swift horses, their tactics built on speed and agility. Arrows rained down from distant hills, striking with deadly accuracy. Ambushes appeared from the desert sands, vanishing before the heavy armored knights could give chase. The long marches under relentless sun broke many men before they ever faced a blade. Water skins dried, men collapsed in the dust, and discipline faltered under the weight of exhaustion. Yet even in such trials, warriors adapted. They learned from what they saw, sometimes adopting the weapons of their enemies, carrying curved blades or lighter shields to match the speed of battle. They learned to travel by night when the air was cooler, to conserve water, to listen for the warning signs of ambush. Slowly, painfully, they carved their way across the foreign land, leaving behind both victories and graves. The encounters with new cultures left lasting impressions. Some warriors wrote of the strange beauty of Eastern architecture, of gardens with flowing water, of libraries filled with books beyond counting. To men from lands where parchment was rare and books were treasures, such knowledge seemed almost magical. Priests debated with scholars, merchants traded goods, and sometimes warriors found themselves in conversations that blurred the lines between enemy and guest. War did not erase curiosity, and in stolen moments of peace, men gazed in wonder at the world they had been told was entirely foreign. But the Crusades were not only battles of steel. They were also battles of faith, and the weight of belief pressed heavily on every heart. To march under sacred banners gave courage, but it also demanded sacrifice. Men who faltered were branded cowards, and death was often seen as martyrdom, a holy passage. Warriors prayed before each fight, sometimes carrying relics or holy symbols sewn into their clothing, believing these would shield them better than iron. And when companions fell, their deaths were not only mourned but lifted as proof of divine purpose, even when the grief cut deep. Still, the scars of such journeys never faded. For every story of glory, there were 100 of suffering, of hunger, disease, betrayal, and despair. Many who set out never returned, their bones left in foreign soil. Those who did return brought back more than scars. They carried new words, new foods, new ideas, fragments of cultures that would ripple through their own lands for generations. And so the life of a medieval warrior was not confined to muddy fields and stone castles. For some, it stretched across oceans, into deserts, into cities of light and wonder. To live such a life meant to carry both the weight of war and the memories of distant worlds, woven together in a story that was far greater than any one man could have imagined when he first strapped on a sword. While many warriors marched far away on crusades, life in Europe itself did not pause. Castles grew busier, villages carried on, and those who remained behind found themselves in a world that was slowly changing. For every man who rode east, another stayed to guard the homeland, to hold fortresses against rival lords, or to protect the long roads that connected markets and towns. These warriors lived in a world that was at once familiar and restless, for the absence of so many men often left power struggles at home more dangerous than battles abroad. The castle stood at the center of much of this life. To live within its walls was to live within a miniature world. Stables with neighing horses, smithies clanging with iron, kitchens alive with smoke and chatter, and chapels where candles flickered day and night. For a warrior stationed there, the days followed a rhythm both strict and comforting. Training at dawn, duties through the day, drills with weapons, and patrols across the surrounding lands. The castle was not only a fortress but also a symbol of authority, its tall stone towers casting long shadows across fields where peasants worked from sunrise to dusk. For villagers, the presence of warriors was both reassurance and burden. They knew that armed men could protect them against raiders, but they also knew that their harvests and labor supported those same soldiers. A tithe of grain, barrels of ale, sides of pork, all flowed into the castle to feed the garrison. In return, villagers expected safety, yet safety was never certain. Rival lords might raid without warning, stealing cattle, burning homes, dragging men away as prisoners. In such times, warriors rode out quickly, answering the cries of their people, though often the damage was already done. Festivals, however, brought moments of relief. Even warriors joined the villagers in celebration, drinking and dancing around fires, competing in archery contests or showing their strength in wrestling matches. The clash of war was set aside for a night, replaced by laughter and song. At such times, distinctions between knight and common soldier blurred, and even between soldier and peasant, for joy belonged to all. Still, when the fires burned low and dawn approached, armor was once again strapped on, swords sharpened, and the weight of duty returned. Romance wove itself into this life in quiet, complicated ways. Knights often courted ladies of noble families, their exchanges filled with formality, poems, and gestures of chivalry. Yet love was rarely simple, bound by the chains of alliances, dowries, and family honor. For common soldiers, love might be found in fleeting encounters during marches, or in village taverns where music played and ale flowed. Some warriors fathered children far from home, never seeing them again, their lives swept away in the tides of war. Others built families that endured despite the separations, bonds of loyalty and affection carrying them through years of absence. Stories of distant crusaders filtered back into these lands, carried by messengers, merchants, or travelers. Tales of golden cities, holy relics, and vast armies filled the imaginations of those who stayed behind. Around hearths, warriors whispered of comrades who had marched east, wondering if they still lived, if they had found glory, or if their bones lay under foreign skies. These stories fed both curiosity and unease, reminding everyone that the world was larger than their fields and forests. Meanwhile, training continued with relentless discipline. Warriors knew that even in times of quiet, the next conflict might come suddenly. Young squires learned to handle weapons under the stern eyes of older men. They practiced jousting with wooden lances, riding against spinning targets that swung to strike them if they missed. They sparred with blunt swords until their arms ached, ran across courtyards in heavy armor, learned to clean and repair every strap and buckle. Discipline was not just about skill but about patience, about obedience, about learning to move as part of a greater whole. The weapons themselves changed slowly over time. Crossbows began to appear more often, their bolts piercing through armor with terrible force. Longbows in skilled hands rained arrows that could shift the course of battles. These new weapons frightened knights, for the glory of armored combat was threatened by missiles that struck from afar. Yet they also fascinated men, and some devoted themselves to mastering these tools of war. A crossbowman might not wear shining armor or ride a horse, but his skill was feared, his role respected in the brutal calculus of battle. And as all of this unfolded, religion remained the unshakable foundation. Bells rang each morning, calling men to prayer. Chapels echoed with chants, candles burning as warriors knelt before altars. They confessed sins, sought blessings, and prayed for protection. Priests walked among them, offering comfort, reminding them of heaven's promise, warning them of damnation. Faith bound the lives of warriors tightly, shaping their choices, their fears, and their hopes. Thus, while some marched across deserts and foreign lands, those who stayed lived lives just as demanding, filled with duty, hardship, fleeting joy, and constant readiness. For whether in distant crusades or in quiet valleys, the life of the medieval warrior was never simple. It was a life lived always under the shadow of uncertainty, always moving between moments of peace and storms of violence, always carrying the heavy weight of sword, shield, and faith. When a castle came under siege, the entire rhythm of life changed in an instant. Walls that once felt strong became prisons, and the open courtyards where children played filled with tension and fear. Warriors who had trained for years suddenly found themselves tested, not on an open field, but within stone walls where survival depended on endurance as much as courage. The first sign of danger often came from a distant plume of smoke, a village set alight by raiders or rival forces. Scouts would ride in quickly, warning of an approaching army, and then the work began. Gates were locked, supplies rushed inside, livestock herded into cramped enclosures. Every barrel of water and sack of grain mattered, for a siege could last weeks, even months. Those who lived inside the castle knew they would be tested by hunger long before steel clashed with steel. Siege engines were among the most terrifying sights a defender could face. Great wooden towers, tall as the castle walls, rolled slowly forward, bristling with archers who could unleash volleys from above. Catapults hurled stones that shook the ground as they crashed into towers, breaking masonry and sending shards flying. Trebuchets, immense machines of counterweights and ropes, flung projectiles with such force that entire sections of wall could collapse under their relentless pounding. The defenders answered with their own weapons, pouring boiling water, oil, or melted pitch onto attackers, launching stones from their own engines, firing arrows until quivers ran dry. Night offered little rest. Fires were lit along the battlements, torches flickering as sentries walked their rounds. Every creak in the darkness carried suspicion. Every howl of wind might conceal the sound of enemy sappers digging tunnels beneath the walls. To counter these tunnels, defenders would set bowls of water along the ground, watching for the slightest ripple that betrayed the digging below. When discovered, they would send their own men down with pickaxes and fire to collapse the tunnels. Battles fought in choking darkness deep beneath the earth. Inside the castle, life grew harsh quickly. Fresh food spoiled, and meals became smaller, then smaller still. Bread hardened until it cracked teeth. Meat was salted until it was nearly inedible. Some castles resorted to boiling leather or grinding bones when supplies dwindled. Children cried from hunger, mothers whispered prayers, and warriors forced themselves to stand firm, though their stomachs gnawed with emptiness. Rats, once scorned, became prey. Hunger was as much a weapon as the sword. Yet even in these desperate moments, the will to resist burned fiercely. Defenders knew that surrender often meant death or slavery, for mercy was rare in medieval war. This knowledge steeled them, gave strength to weary arms, and bound them together as brothers and sisters in defiance. Songs were sometimes sung in the courtyards to keep spirits alive, verses of defiance shouted from the walls at enemies who camped below. The clash of voices was as important as the clash of steel, for morale could tip the balance as surely as weapons. When an assault came, it was chaos. Ladders slammed against walls, men swarming upward with shields raised and swords ready. Arrows fell from above, stones crushed those climbing, but still they came, desperate to plant their banner upon the battlements. The roar of combat echoed against stone. Men grappled hand to hand. Weapons clanged in the smoke of torches and burning pitch. Blood stained the steps, and cries of pain mixed with the clash of steel. The defenders fought not only for their lord but for their own lives, knowing that if the walls fell, there would be no refuge. Sometimes relief came suddenly. A distant horn, the sight of allied banners on the horizon, and the besieging army broke away in haste, unwilling to risk being caught between castle and reinforcements. Other times, there was no relief, only surrender, negotiated at the breaking point when famine or disease made further resistance impossible. Even in surrender, uncertainty reigned. Would the victors honor their word, or would treachery follow? History tells of both, of castles spared and of castles burned despite promises made. For the warrior who survived such a siege, the memory never faded. The sounds of stones striking walls, the groan of timbers, the smell of smoke and death, they lingered in the mind long after. Some spoke of it only rarely, while others retold the stories endlessly, reminding listeners of the courage and suffering endured within those walls. It was a different kind of battle than those fought on open fields, slower, harsher, yet no less defining. And still, between such moments of terror, life returned to its rhythm. Villages rebuilt, fields were sown once more, and castles repaired their scars. The resilience of the people was astonishing, for despite repeated destruction, they always found a way to continue. Warriors, too, returned to their training, their patrols, their meals of bread and ale, waiting for the next call to arms. For in the medieval world, peace was never more than a pause, fragile and fleeting. When warriors left the stone walls behind and marched toward an open battlefield, the air itself seemed charged with a different kind of tension. There was no hiding within towers, no thick gates to slow the enemy's hand. The horizon stretched wide, and the clash was inevitable, visible from miles away as banners fluttered in the wind and the dust of armies rose into the sky. The days before a battle were filled with an uneasy rhythm. Scouts returned with reports of enemy numbers, and lords would gather their knights and captains beneath great pavilions to whisper over maps, debating where to stand, how to move, which hills or rivers might give them an edge. Warriors, meanwhile, checked their gear with quiet precision, sharpening blades, patching armor, tying leather straps again and again, as though repetition could chase away the gnawing weight of fear. Some prayed to saints or clutched small relics, while others drank heavily, convincing themselves courage could be found at the bottom of a cup. On the morning of battle, the camp came alive with sound. Trumpets cut the air, horses snorted and stamped. Men shouted orders as they formed lines stretching across the fields. Dust rose from thousands of boots and hooves. The sight was overwhelming. Rows of shields, spears glittering in the sun, knights in polished armor sitting tall in their saddles. The noise grew louder as drums beat and horns called, a thunder that rolled across the earth before a single weapon was raised. The first clash was chaos. Arrows darkened the sky, whistling down in deadly showers. Shields rattled under the impact. Men fell screaming. Horses reared and toppled. Then came the surge of infantry, walls of men pressing against each other with shields locked, spears thrusting forward, swords hacking in close quarters. The ground grew slippery with blood and mud, boots slipping, men wrestling more than fighting. It was not elegant, not glorious. It was a grinding storm of noise and pain, where victory belonged to the side that could endure the longest. Knights on horseback often decided the tide. When they charged, it was like a thunderstorm breaking loose, dozens or hundreds of armored riders bearing down with lances leveled, the earth itself trembling under the weight of hooves. Infantry lines bent and shattered under such force, and men were crushed before steel even touched them. Yet cavalry charges were not invincible. Sharp stakes driven into the ground, or muddy terrain that swallowed hooves, could turn that thunder into disaster in moments. Warriors caught in the crush often found themselves pinned beneath fallen horses, struggling to breathe as the chaos raged above. For those who fought on foot, time itself became strange. Minutes felt like hours, each breath a struggle, each swing of the sword draining strength. Noise surrounded them so completely, shouts, screams, metal ringing, drums pounding, that the mind almost shut down, focused only on survival. Friends disappeared in an instant, swallowed by the press of bodies, while enemies seemed endless, one face after another in the chaos. To fall was often death, for once on the ground, it was nearly impossible to rise again among trampling boots. When the lines finally broke, it was brutal. Panic spread like fire, and once an army began to flee, few could stop it. Pursuers cut down those who ran, and the battlefield became a place of slaughter. Only when the banners fell and the horns of victory sounded did the killing ease, though the ground remained littered with the broken. Shields splintered, lances snapped, men groaning or silent forever. Survivors staggered among the fallen, searching for comrades, binding wounds with strips of cloth, or simply staring in shock at what remained. And yet, in the aftermath, a strange quiet descended. Birds returned cautiously to the fields, crows circling above. Fires were lit for the wounded, priests moved among the dying offering last rites, and captives were gathered under guard. Victory was celebrated, yes, but it carried a heaviness too, for everyone knew the cost. Even the lords who gained glory and land understood that fortune could change tomorrow, and today's triumph might be forgotten in the ashes of another defeat. For the warrior, the memory of such days clung like smoke. Some spoke proudly of their courage, others avoided the subject altogether. But all carried the weight of it, etched deep into their bones. The sound of steel, the smell of blood and earth, the desperate faces of both friend and foe. It was not a memory easily escaped, even in times of peace. And when peace did return, however briefly, the warriors sought ways to remind themselves they were alive. There were tournaments, grand gatherings where knights could clash in mock battles without the finality of war. There was laughter in the camps again, music played by wandering minstrels, dice rolled on wooden tables, cups of ale lifted in noisy celebration. For a short while, the battlefield was forgotten, though in the back of every mind lingered the knowledge that another summons, another march, was never far away. After the thunder of battles, the quieter rhythms of life returned, though never without the memory of the clash. Villages rebuilt what was broken, farmers mended fields churned by marching armies, and families awaited news of sons, brothers, or fathers who had vanished into distant campaigns. The warrior who survived such trials often found himself in a strange balance, caught between the silence of home and the echo of the battlefield that still rang in his mind. Daily life in these intervals of peace was simple but never easy. Warriors who returned home did not live apart from common folk as much as one might think. Yes, knights of noble birth often dwelled in fortified halls, where tapestries softened the chill of stone walls and fires burned in long hearths. Yet even there, life was ruled by necessity. Food needed storing, weapons required care, and servants bustled with endless chores. The warrior himself might exchange his sword for the plow in times of peace, guiding oxen across the soil, reminding his body that strength was needed for more than war. Meals were humble, but they carried their own comfort. Bread baked from coarse flour, salted fish, stews of beans, cabbage, and whatever meat could be spared. In wealthier halls, tables were lined with roasted fowl, venison, spiced dishes brought from distant trade routes, and wine poured into metal goblets. Yet even the richest feast could not wholly erase the memory of eating in the field, crouched over a fire with only dry bread, hard cheese, or a thin broth cooked in a dented pot. Those contrasts made every warm meal at home taste sharper, as though the warrior understood its value in ways others could not. And when evening fell, there was no shortage of attempts to drive away the long hours of darkness. Music filled the air, played by wandering minstrels strumming lutes or plucking harps. They sang of heroes, of tragic loves, of victories half forgotten but sung as though eternal. These songs stitched warriors into a greater story, reminding them that their suffering was not in vain, that names lost to the mud of the battlefield might still live on in melody. Dice and board games clattered on wooden tables, wagers made in coin or in promises of ale. The laughter was often rough, but it was laughter nonetheless, a sound almost as healing as any prayer. Tournaments became the grand theater of peace. Warriors from across the land gathered not only to compete, but to prove themselves before lords, ladies, and the ever-watchful eyes of their peers. The joust was the most dazzling spectacle. Two knights charging at each other with lances leveled, the crowd roaring as wood splintered and men crashed from their saddles. But there were other contests too: sword fights, archery displays, melees where groups of men clashed in controlled chaos, each blow measured but still dangerous. For the warrior, these were more than games. They were training disguised as glory, a chance to sharpen skills without the finality of bloodshed. And for the people, they were celebrations, a rare chance to cheer without fear. Yet tournaments were not only about combat. They were woven with ceremony. Ladies offered favors, ribbons or tokens tied to a knight's arm or shield, as silent wishes for victory. Heralds announced names with pride, banners snapped in the wind, and feasts followed with music, wine, and storytelling that stretched long into the night. Alliances were formed here, marriages arranged, rivalries kindled as much by pride as by politics. For the warrior, a single victory could lift his name, and a single defeat could echo for years. Still, away from the bright noise of the lists, there was a quieter world that shaped the warrior's days. The church bells tolled, calling men and women alike to prayer, for no life in medieval times was untouched by faith. Before battles, before meals, before journeys, prayers were offered to saints and relics kissed in hope of divine protection. Pilgrimages to holy sites were undertaken by some, not only to seek forgiveness but also to gain favor in war. Warriors might leave coins, weapons, or even armor at shrines, believing such offerings would shield them from death. Superstitions also ran deep. Men tied charms to their belts, whispered small chants before stepping into the field, or avoided certain omens entirely. An owl hooting at the wrong hour, a broken sword edge, the unexpected cry of a child. To live in such a world was to believe that unseen forces, both holy and ominous, walked beside you always. For the warrior, such beliefs were less about choice and more about survival. When death was never far, even the faintest promise of luck was clung to with fierce conviction. And yet, despite faith, despite festivals, despite the warmth of hearths and laughter, the warrior knew that peace was fragile. At any moment, a messenger might arrive with sealed letters, a trumpet might sound in the courtyard, or rumors might sweep across the land that another lord, another king, another rival was calling men to arms. In such moments, everything shifted once again. Plows abandoned, tournaments halted, prayers whispered with greater urgency. The rhythm of life tilted back toward war, and the warrior prepared once more to march into the uncertainty of another campaign. Long campaigns carried warriors far from the comfort of home, stretching their endurance in ways that few could imagine. Roads seemed endless, winding through forests where sunlight barely touched the ground, across marshes that swallowed boots and mud, and over mountains where frost bit at ears and fingers despite the thickest cloaks. The landscape itself became a test, for the elements could kill as surely as a spear. Rain soaked through tunics and chainmail, turning marches into grueling treks over slippery ground. Snow blinded travelers and froze water in their canteens, while scorching sun baked exposed skin and drained strength with every step. Supplies were always a concern. Armies consumed vast quantities of bread, salted meat, cheese, and whatever else could be carried or foraged along the way. Rivers provided water, but often it was stagnant or muddied, carrying illness that spread quickly through camps. Soldiers grew adept at finding food where others might have failed. Fishing in streams, trapping small animals, gathering wild herbs. Yet scarcity was constant, and hunger gnawed at morale. It was not uncommon for men to nibble on roots or even bark when rations ran out, knowing that strength and survival depended on the smallest scrap of nourishment. Camps themselves became temporary worlds. Soldiers pitched tents or slept under trees, often close to one another for warmth and protection. Fires crackled as men cooked, told stories, or cursed fate, smoke rising into the darkening sky. Even in the midst of discomfort, small moments of camaraderie persisted. A shared piece of bread, a song hummed quietly by a minstrel, a game of dice to pass the time. Laughter sometimes erupted despite fatigue, but it was fragile, vanishing when the sound of distant horns or enemy movements reminded men that danger was never far. Marching for days or weeks on end created a strange rhythm in the mind. Warriors became attuned to the subtle cues of the environment. The direction of the wind carrying the scent of enemy camps, the distant rumble of hooves, the flash of banners through trees. Sleep was often stolen in short, uneasy intervals, leaning against a tree or curled in a tent, armor and weapons never far away. Dreams mixed the familiar and the terrible. Visions of home blended with flashes of battle, screams of comrades, the smell of burning villages. Even in rest, the body remained alert, primed for the chaos that might strike at any moment. Foreign lands introduced new challenges. Rivers were crossed with hastily built bridges or ferries, unfamiliar terrain slowed progress, and villages spoke languages that soldiers could barely understand. Markets offered strange foods, spicy meats, exotic fruits, flatbreads, and dried fish that were unlike anything at home. Warriors approached them with curiosity but also caution. Unfamiliar environments were as dangerous as enemy forces. Sometimes they traded with locals, exchanging metal coins for food or information. Sometimes they looted, driven by desperation or orders, leaving fear and resentment in their wake. Even in such strange places, religion remained constant. Priests accompanied armies, conducting mass for the living and the dead, blessing banners, and offering last rites to those who fell. Relics were carried as talismans, and prayers were whispered before every engagement. Some warriors fasted according to holy calendars, while others swore to perform pilgrimages upon surviving a campaign. Faith intertwined with daily life, both comforting and demanding, offering hope in the face of exhaustion, injury, and death. The emotional toll of these campaigns was immense. Letters from home were rare, and when they arrived, they carried joy, worry, or grief. Soldiers longed for families they might never see again, for children they had not yet met, for lovers whose faces existed only in memory. Friendships forged in the crucible of shared hardship became a substitute for family, bonds unbreakable yet shadowed by the knowledge that one day, one battle, one misstep could end them forever. Warriors confided in these comrades, shared fears, told stories to keep despair at bay, and honored those who fell with solemn ritual when the march paused or the battle ended. Weather, terrain, hunger, and enemy alike shaped a warrior's identity. Each challenge was a test of endurance, courage, and willpower. Yet even in the harshest moments, small joys punctuated the relentless march. The first warm fire after a freezing night, a loaf of bread baked by a local woman, the distant sound of a bell ringing through a village, the sight of a meadow where flowers bloomed despite the scars of war. These fleeting moments reminded men of the world beyond battle, giving them strength to continue, even when hope seemed distant. And so, the life of a medieval warrior on campaign was a delicate balance between survival and duty, between despair and fleeting joy. The world was vast, uncertain, and relentless. Yet through it all, warriors pressed forward, carrying swords, faith, memories, and the fragile threads of home. Every step, every night under the stars, every battle and every quiet moment became part of a story that was larger than any individual. A story of endurance, courage, and the unyielding rhythm of life in a time when war was never far from the horizon. Camp life became the hidden backbone of a warrior's existence, a place where the line between danger and mundane routine blurred. When armies halted, sometimes for days or weeks, tents were pitched in sprawling encampments that resembled small villages. Each soldier had a role, each tent a purpose. Some men were responsible for tending horses, ensuring the steeds remained strong and fed, brushing out sweat and mud, while others carried water from distant streams, a chore both exhausting and essential. Firewood had to be gathered, and fires kept alive day and night, providing warmth, cooking, and a semblance of comfort amidst uncertainty. The smell of smoke, sweat, and cooking meat hung constantly in the air. Stews boiled in iron pots over flames, flavored with whatever herbs could be found or traded from nearby villages. Bread, often baked in small clay ovens or on flat stones, was shared among comrades, torn roughly by hands still calloused from wielding sword and spear. Salted pork or fish, dried and hard, was rationed carefully. Occasionally, a hunter or forager would return with game, a rabbit or a wild bird, and it was celebrated as a feast, eaten with laughter that temporarily banished the weight of marching fatigue. Even in camp, danger was never far. Night brought both relief and terror. Wolves prowled near the edges, their howls a constant reminder of the wild world beyond the firelight. Thieves or scouts from enemy forces crept close, testing the vigilance of guards. Fires were lit in every cluster of tents, and sentries walked continuously, listening for the faintest sound that might indicate approaching trouble. Sleep was stolen in short, uneasy intervals, often in full armor or with weapons at hand, because one could never be certain that the night would pass without challenge. Yet within these hardships, camaraderie thrived. Soldiers shared stories, songs, and jokes, their voices rising over the crackle of flames. Old tales of famous battles were recounted with exaggeration, often to make the teller seem braver or cleverer than he truly was. Newcomers were teased, challenged, or instructed, and friendships were forged in the fire of shared hardship. Games of dice or small contests of strength provided brief escapes from the constant tension, and victories were celebrated with food, drink, and laughter. Even a simple contest, like racing from one end of camp to the other carrying a bucket of water, could become a highlight, a moment when the pressure of war lifted just slightly. In these quiet stretches, letters from home were treasures. Written hastily by wives, mothers, or siblings, they brought news of births, marriages, or simple messages of love. Soldiers read them repeatedly, memorizing each line, drawing comfort and sometimes tears from the words. The absence of news could be equally heavy, leaving men to wonder if loved ones were safe or if rumors of death were true. Each letter, each scrap of paper, was more than communication. It was a lifeline, a fragile connection to the world they fought to protect and to return to. Training never truly ceased, even in camp. Warriors practiced with wooden swords, poles, and dummies. Archers sharpened skills with endless volleys of arrows, testing accuracy and speed. Cavalry drilled in formation, learning to maneuver together so that when battle came again, movements were instinctive. The discipline of these routines created both physical readiness and mental steadiness, keeping soldiers focused even when boredom threatened to weaken resolve. Hygiene, though primitive by modern standards, was a constant concern. Men washed in streams or rivers when possible, scraped grime from their bodies, and repaired armor to prevent chafing or injury. Lice and fleas were unavoidable companions, but warriors learned to tolerate them. The maintenance of weapons and armor was never-ending. Swords were sharpened and oiled, chainmail cleaned, leather straps examined for wear. A single weak link could mean death in battle, so meticulous care was as vital as strength or skill. Religion and superstition continued to shape life in camp. Priests walked among tents, blessing soldiers before engagement, conducting small ceremonies to honor fallen comrades, and offering counsel. Talismans, charms, or relics were carried constantly, sometimes tucked into clothing, sometimes fastened to swords or belts. Omens were noted: the flight of birds, the appearance of a particular cloud, the cry of animals in the night, and even men hardened by battle gave them weight, acting cautiously or changing plans in response. And yet, for all the fatigue, danger, and monotony, camp life contained the essence of what it meant to be a warrior. Every moment was a mixture of fear and camaraderie, of despair and laughter, of exhaustion and fleeting comfort. It was here, in the quiet spaces between battles, that bonds were formed, that courage was nurtured, that men learned to endure not just steel and arrows, but the long, relentless weight of a life lived on the edge. Every meal, every shared story, every vigil at night became part of a larger story that would follow them across fields, through sieges, and into the memories of the ages. Marching from one stronghold to another, from one battlefield to the next, tested warriors in ways the clash of swords never could. Days stretched endlessly, the horizon always receding, and the body began to ache in places that men did not know could feel pain. Feet blistered in tight boots, shoulders groaned beneath packs and weapons, and even the strongest horses stumbled from exhaustion. The rhythm of the march was relentless. Up at dawn, breakfast swallowed quickly, then step after step across fields, forests, hills, and rivers, until the sun dipped low and camp could be made, or, if the day was harsh, until men collapsed wherever the ground allowed. The mind struggled as much as the body. Endless marching created a strange loop, where each day felt like the last, and yet each brought fresh challenges. Maps were studied constantly, and scouts rode ahead to warn of ambushes, floods, or impassable terrain. Every sound in the forest or along the road carried potential danger. The snap of a branch might mean bandits. The sudden flight of birds could signal enemy scouts, and shadows stretched in ways that set nerves on edge. Warriors became attuned to the smallest details. The sway of a tree, the glint of metal, the scent of smoke. Habits forged to survive, habits that persisted long after the danger passed. Food on the march was a constant concern. Hard biscuits, salted meat, dried cheese, and whatever game could be trapped along the route formed the backbone of sustenance. Streams provided water, but it was often murky or teeming with disease. Illness could spread like wildfire. Dysentery, fevers, and other infections were as deadly as any blade. Men sometimes scavenged what villagers left behind, wary of theft but desperate to avoid starvation. Meals were eaten quickly, often on the move, with no ceremony, no fire, no warmth, only the necessity to sustain the body for the endless next step. Sleep, when it came, was never deep. Warriors found spots in the forest or on hillsides, laying on straw, dirt, or whatever they could gather. Armor was loosened, but never removed entirely, weapons kept within reach. The night carried noises, wolves howling, the rustle of leaves, distant shouts, that kept men half alert, muscles tensed for sudden attacks. Dreams were a blend of hope and horror, sometimes carrying images of home, sometimes reliving recent battles, sometimes merging both into impossible visions that left hearts pounding upon waking. Fatigue affected not only the body but also the mind and spirit. Arguments broke out more easily. Small mistakes were magnified. Leaders struggled to maintain morale, reminding soldiers of purpose, of duty, of the rewards that awaited bravery or loyalty. Songs were hummed to pass the time, jokes exchanged to stave off despair, and sometimes men spoke quietly of loved ones, of letters never received, of faces they longed to see. These moments of conversation, however brief, provided a fragile thread of humanity amidst the relentless grind. Weather compounded the strain. Rain turned roads into mud. Rivers swelled and became impassable. Tents collapsed under storms, and armor trapped cold and wet against skin. Sun scorched exposed flesh, and dust from long dry roads choked lungs and covered eyes. Snow brought frostbite, slippery paths, and the constant fear of collapse in isolation. Each day required careful preparation. Shoes and boots greased, cloaks tied tight, armor inspected, weapons sharpened. Even small errors could lead to injury, illness, or worse. Despite hardship, camaraderie was vital. Warriors leaned on one another to carry burdens, share food, and boost spirits. Songs echoed across hills, chants marked the rhythm of marching, and in quiet moments, men would teach each other new skills, swap stories, or laugh at absurdities of life on the road. These bonds were more than friendship. They were survival tools, knitting a fragile human network against the grinding pressures of exhaustion, fear, and isolation. Long marches also bred reflection. Soldiers thought about life at home, about the families they might never see again, about villages and castles left behind, and about the ever-present possibility of death. Some wrote letters on scraps of parchment, attempting to preserve a link to the world they loved. Others prayed ceaselessly, seeking protection from unseen forces. And in rare moments, a meadow, a river, or a sunrise brought unexpected beauty. A reminder that the world was larger than suffering, that hope still existed, however faint. Thus, the march was both test and teacher. Every step honed endurance, every hardship forged resilience. Every shared hardship deepened loyalty and understanding among men. It was a crucible in which warriors were reshaped, molded by fatigue, danger, and the relentless passage of land and time. The march was never over. Each day was a new trial, each mile a new story, each horizon a challenge that demanded courage, patience, and a spirit unyielding. For the road itself was as formidable as any army or siege they would face. Arriving at a foreign city or fortress after days, sometimes weeks, of grueling marches brought a mixture of relief, awe, and unease. The walls rose like mountains, stone towers piercing the sky, banners snapping in the wind, while gates stood massive and unyielding, their iron-bound doors both invitation and warning. Warriors dismounted, stretched stiff legs, and took in the unfamiliar surroundings with eyes sharpened by months of travel and anticipation. Every detail mattered. The angle of the walls, the number of sentries visible, the narrow alleys that might conceal ambushes. The first tasks were immediate and practical. Camps were set up outside the gates, sometimes on open plains, sometimes in groves of trees, always with a watchful eye on entrances and potential escape routes. Horses were tended, water fetched, and fires lit for cooking and warmth. Scouts were dispatched to survey the fortress, noting weaknesses or entrances that might serve as avenues for attack, while senior officers met with local guides, interpreting maps and sketching rough plans. Every action carried weight, for misjudgment could mean the loss of men, horses, and supplies before the first sword was ever drawn. Food, always a concern, became urgent. Marching armies consumed vast quantities of provisions, and local sources were quickly assessed. Rivers provided water, markets offered supplies, and local farms or villages were approached with both diplomacy and caution. Some food could be traded, but often it was requisitioned forcibly, leaving locals resentful yet powerless. Warriors learned to ration carefully. Bread was cut into small portions, salted meats stretched over days, and the most perishable items, cheese, fresh vegetables, consumed immediately. Even in abundance, every meal was weighed against the knowledge of future scarcity. The climate and terrain of a foreign land imposed additional challenges. Narrow streets, unfamiliar roads, and the unfamiliar architecture of buildings required careful navigation. Stone pavements were slick when wet, uneven courtyards could trip the unwary, and the unfamiliar local climate tested both body and morale. Warriors were alert at all times, for city streets and fortress walls could conceal spies, assassins, or sudden attacks from unseen enemies. Every shadow and noise was scrutinized, every alley suspected, every passerby considered potentially dangerous. Soldiers quickly adapted to local customs, often out of necessity. Markets operated under different rules, languages were foreign, and even the gestures of greeting or respect were unfamiliar. Warriors relied on interpreters, guides, or the slow but steady learning of new words and phrases. Misunderstandings could escalate into conflict, so caution became a constant companion. Despite this, curiosity persisted. Markets were colorful, filled with spices, fabrics, and trinkets unknown at home. Foods, scents, and sounds fascinated the men even as they reminded them how far they had come. Rest was still difficult to come by. Nights in a foreign land were tense. Sentries walked tirelessly, wary of infiltration or surprise attacks. Tents were pitched wherever space allowed, sometimes pressed against walls for cover, sometimes spread in open fields for visibility. Fires crackled as soldiers cooked meager meals, shared stories, and tried to keep morale steady. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by the need to stand watch or by the occasional distant cry that suggested trouble might be near. Warriors learned to rest quickly and lightly, muscles tense even in slumber, eyes opening at the slightest sound. Training and preparation continued, for arrival did not mean battle was imminent, yet readiness was paramount. Archers practiced on rooftops or courtyards, testing range and accuracy. Infantry drilled with pikes and swords, ensuring coordination and timing. Cavalry rode in circles, practicing charges, turns, and formations that could mean life or death once the gates opened. Weapons were inspected repeatedly, armor polished and repaired, and horses fed and exercised. Everything in these preparations was deliberate, every detail intended to maximize advantage in the uncertain days ahead. Religion and superstition remained essential. Priests offered prayers for success and protection, blessing banners, weapons, and soldiers themselves. Relics were displayed, candles lit, and rituals performed to ward off misfortune. Soldiers, weary and anxious, clung to these symbols as if they could carry them through the dangers they knew awaited. Omens were observed closely. A broken spear, an owl perched near the walls, even the direction of the wind. Faith, habit, and fear intertwined to guide decisions in ways that outsiders might never understand. And amidst all this, the psychological strain weighed heavily. The city or fortress seemed massive and alien, filled with unknowns. Men feared what they could not see. Secret passages, hidden defenders, or sudden sorties in the dark. Each day was a mixture of curiosity, boredom, tension, and vigilance. Friendships and rivalries were magnified, gossip spread quickly, and every decision, from where to pitch a tent to how to interact with locals, carried a subtle weight. The arrival was only the beginning. The true test lay ahead, whether in the form of battle, siege, or the slow attrition of occupation. Thus, the first days in a foreign stronghold became a world unto themselves. Warriors navigated unfamiliar terrain, assessed threats, maintained discipline, and clung to fragile routines that preserved both life and morale. Every meal, every guard shift, every patrol was an act of endurance. Every glance at the towering walls and bustling streets reminded them that their presence mattered, that victory or disaster could hinge on the smallest detail. Arrival was not triumph. It was the opening chapter of a challenge that would test courage, skill, and resilience in ways the long marches had only begun to prepare them for. The first skirmishes often arrived unexpectedly, like a sudden storm breaking across the calm of camp life. Warriors would awaken to shouts, the thunder of hooves, and the clatter of weapons as scouts or raiding parties engaged in tense encounters. Even before a full battle erupted, these skirmishes demanded vigilance and quick thinking. A small group of enemy soldiers might appear along the city outskirts, attempting to ambush supply lines, steal livestock, or spread fear. In response, patrols moved swiftly, shields raised, swords drawn, spears thrust ready, each movement precise yet improvisational, for the terrain and timing were never predictable. Within the city or fortress, interactions with locals added layers of complexity. Some residents watched silently from windows, wary but curious, while merchants continued their business under the watchful eyes of soldiers. Messages passed in whispers, rumors flitted through narrow alleys, and sometimes children ran ahead of patrols, giggling or begging for coins. Warriors learned quickly to read expressions and gestures, to discern who could be trusted and who might secretly aid the enemy. Even a simple handshake could carry risk, and yet diplomacy, subtle and cautious, often achieved what swords could not. Sieges began with meticulous planning. Scouts mapped walls, noted guard rotations, measured distances for catapults and trebuchets, and assessed weak points in fortifications. Engineers worked tirelessly, constructing ladders, siege towers, or wooden bridges to cross moats. Piles of stones, arrows, and boiling oil were stockpiled, ready for both attack and defense. Every movement was calculated, yet uncertainty always lurked. A single misjudgment, a rotten plank, an unexpected patrol, a misfired catapult, could turn preparation into disaster. The first assaults were terrifying in their intensity. Warriors approached walls under a hail of arrows and boiling oil, mud and blood making footing treacherous. Siege towers rolled forward slowly, carrying soldiers high above ground, while defenders launched projectiles that shattered wood and armor alike. Boiling pitch splashed onto attackers, screams of pain mingled with the clash of steel, and horses reared or fell beneath the chaos. Each moment was a test of endurance and courage, where training and instinct collided with raw fear. Inside the fortress, defenders watched through narrow slits, hurling stones, firing crossbows, and pouring tar onto those who approached too closely. The roar of engines, the pounding of feet, and the clash of weapons created a cacophony that echoed across courtyards and ramparts. Warriors learned that success depended not only on bravery but on teamwork, timing, and observation. One misstep could expose a comrade to death, and even the most skilled fighter could be caught off guard by terrain, tide, or timing. Between assaults, tension never fully abated. Warriors patched armor, sharpened blades, tended wounds, and adjusted equipment. Fires were lit to boil water and cook meager rations, while scouts relayed information about enemy positions and movements. Sleep was fleeting, interrupted by distant shouts, the crackle of alarms, or the thrum of distant drums signaling another skirmish. These pauses were as demanding as the fighting itself, for exhaustion weakened muscles and minds alike, and the smallest lapse could be fatal. Interactions with locals were equally delicate. Some residents offered guidance or resources, hoping to curry favor or protect property, while others whispered warnings of hidden dangers or secret passages. Language barriers complicated everything. Gestures, expressions, and the tone of voice became essential tools of understanding. Miscommunication could spark violence, yet careful observation often yielded critical intelligence. Warriors learned to watch, listen, and interpret subtleties, knowing that the survival of themselves and their comrades could hinge on these small interactions. Even when battle ebbed temporarily, the psychological strain was profound. Men could hear the cries of wounded or dying, smell smoke from burning sections of walls or buildings, and see friends fall, sometimes slowly, sometimes instantly. Anxiety was constant. Shadows seemed to move with intent, and the mind became attuned to danger in ways that could not be turned off. Yet soldiers persisted, drawing courage from training, faith, camaraderie, and the thought of honor or reward. Every skirmish, every failed assault, every moment of hesitation taught lessons that were as valuable as any victory. Religion and superstition remained central. Priests blessed banners and soldiers, conducted rites for the dead, and reminded men of divine favor and protection. Warriors carried charms, recited prayers, and observed omens. An owl hooting near the walls, a crow landing atop a tower, even the direction of the wind could influence strategy or caution. Faith intertwined with strategy, emotion, and instinct, shaping every decision in subtle but profound ways. Thus, the early days of engagement in a foreign city or fortress were a crucible. Skirmishes tested agility and awareness, sieges demanded endurance and precision, and interactions with locals required caution and diplomacy. Warriors were stretched to their limits, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Every decision mattered, every misstep carried consequences, and yet life persisted. Between the chaos of battle and the monotony of waiting, the men learned the hardest lesson of all. Survival depended as much on observation, patience, and understanding as it did on sword, spear, and shield.